האם זה באמת סגולה בדוקה? הסגולה ללמוד בזה?
Erev Tov and good evening, everyone. We are in the Zera Shimshon, starting the second sefer of the Torah, sefer Shmot, with, of course, Parsha Shmot. Now let us turn to Os Yud Gimel, and you may find that in the sefer. If you're using the sefer also, that's on Daf Tuf Tzadi Dalid, Os Yud Gimel, section 13. And here, let's also take a look at a pasuk that the Zera Shimshon is going to discuss. This is when Moshe and Aharon first come to Paro, and we are in Perek Hey, Pasuk Dalid, in Parsha Shmos. And they come to Paro, and they say that they ask him, they tell him it's time. God, Hashem wants them, has sent them to bring out the Jewish people and to go on a journey into the Midbar and to make sacrifices and bring them to Hashem. So Paro says, Vayomer Alehem Melech Mitzrayim, and Paro said to them, this was his response, Lama Moshe v'Aaron tafriu es ha'ami ma'asav. Moshe and Aaron, why are you bothering the people, disturbing the people from doing their work, their actions? L'chu l'sivlo seichem. Go to your burdens. Go back to your work. That's what the pasuk says. So again, Paro says to them, Moshe and Aaron, you're coming me and telling me you want to take the people away. Your God has commanded you to take the people into the Midbar and offer sacrifices and have a holiday, have a Chag L'Hashem, a holiday to Hashem. All I understand from your request is that you're trying to get the people whose work is very important to stop doing their work. So why are you bothering them? And then he says to Moshe and Aaron, you know what, you two, you also should go back to your burdens and your work. So the Zera Shimshon is going to tell us a very important Rashi and then analyze the whole situation for us. And he's going to share with us a tremendous chiddush, a very powerful novel idea as he develops his this piece. So, Os Yud Gimel. Pasuk, it says in the Pasuk that we just read, L'chu l'siv lo seichem. Paro said, go back to your work. Pirish Rashi. Rashi explains, L'chu l'malachtechem sheyesh lachem la'asos b'vateichem. What Paro meant when he said, go back to your burdens, was Moshe and Aaron, go back to the work that you do in your own homes. You have things, you must have responsibilities in your own homes. Go back and do those things. Avol melecha shibud Mitzrayim, but he was not referring to the slavery, the work of slaves in Egypt. Lo hayisal shivato shel Levi. That was not put on the Shevet of Levi, on the tribe of Levi. Ad kan lishono, until here is the language of Rashi. So Rashi is very careful here to tell us, to point out to us and say, when Paro said to Moshe and Aaron, who were of course from Shevet Levi, from the tribe of Levi, go back to your burdens and your work, he could not have been referring to what we think of as the burdens and the work that the Jews did in Mitzrayim, of their major building efforts and their major building jobs and all of the things that they had to do as avodim, as slaves. Paro could not be referring to that. So don't think that, Rashi says. Why? Because Shevet Levi was not responsible to do the shibud, was not enslaved and responsible to do the work of slaves in Egypt. So what did Paro mean? So Rashi explained, he meant go back to your homes and do whatever work. Do the things that you have to do at home, but leave me alone and don't bother me with these foolish requests about letting the people leave and go into the Midbar. That's Rashi. Upirshu zichronim levracha, and the Zera Shimshon continues that the Meforshim explain shahayasasibo me'es Hashem. The fact that Shevet Levi was protected and not forced into slave labor in Egypt was a specific, Hashem had a specific reason for that. Lefi she'asidin laseis hamishkan, because in the future Shevet Levi would be responsible to carry the Mishkan, the lavod b'mikdash, and to do certain kinds of work in the Beis HaMikdash in the future. So Shevet Levi, of course, had very specific responsibilities in the Mishkan and when the Mishkan traveled, and also ultimately in the future Beis HaMikdash as well. And because they were going to do that work, Hashem did not want them to do slave labor in Egypt. Hashem wanted, so to speak, to preserve them to be prepared in the future to do their holiest of work, of holiest of avoda, and did not want them to do the menial slave labor in Egypt. So the Zera Shimshon kind of sets the stage with Rashi's explanation on the pasuk that Shevet Levi did not have to do slave labor, and then the reason that the Meforshim bring for that. And now he is going to ask a question, very fundamental, important question. Umakshim, and we ask the following question: V'halo stama kosev. Is it not true that there's a pasuk, and this is from the Bris Bein HaBesarim, when Hashem appeared to Abraham and communicated to him what would happen to the Jewish people in the future and how they would be taken from Eretz Canaan to a land that was not theirs, to a foreign land, and enslaved there. So v'halo stama kosev, doesn't it say openly in the pasuk ki ger yeh zaracha be'eretz lo lahem, that Hashem says to Avram, your people will be strangers, they'll be gerim, in a land that does not belong to them. Va'avadum, and the people of that nation will enslave them. Ve'inu osam, and oppress them. That is all a quote from the pasuk taken from the Bris Bein HaBesarim. As you can see, the source that the Zera Shimshon quotes, Bereshis Perek Tesvav pasuk Yud Gimel. Ve'av Shevet Levi bichlal zarecha, and Shevet Levi is certainly included in the word your children. So if Hashem told Abraham at the Bris Bein HaBesarim, Zaracha, your children, Abraham, your descendants will go to a land that is not theirs. They'll be strangers in a land that doesn't belong to them, and the people there will enslave them and oppress them. Would we not think that that applies to Levi? Of course we would, because Levi is part of Abraham, our descendants of Abraham. So how was it possible that this gezerah, this decree that Hashem communicated to Abraham by the Bris Bein HaBesarim was not fulfilled? Let's pause to just clearly understand this very important question. We have a Rashi which said that the Shevet Levi was not forced to do slave labor in Egypt. Zera Shimshon says, but we have a pasuk that seems to say that all of Abraham's descendants would go down to a land not their own, which of course was Egypt, and they would be enslaved there and be oppressed there. How did that not apply to Shevet Levi? That's the question. The Yesh Lomar, and we can say the Havale Lemichtav, because the pasuk could have written Ki yiyeh zaracha be'eretz lo lahem ger, that your children will be in a land that does not belong to them, strangers. They will be strangers in that land. Va'avadum ve'inu osam v'chulu, and the people of this land will enslave them and oppress them. And the point that the Zera Shimshon's making is that the pasuk could have put the word ger, strangers, next to va'avadum ve'inu osam, that they will be enslaved and they will be oppressed. It could have put that all together. V'have mashma, and then the pasuk would have taught us shekulam bichlal va'avadum, that all of Abraham's descendants are included in the servitude that was being foretold. Aval hashda because of ger beresha, but now that in actuality when we look at the pasuk, we see that the word ger, being a stranger, is in the beginning of the pasuk. Va'achar kach hifsik, and then there's an interruption of some other words. V'kosav, and later on in the pasuk it writes va'avadum ve'inu osam, and they will be enslaved and oppressed. Mashma, this teaches us shegezeros hageros hayasa kolelos l'chol mishahu mizaro shel Avraham, that it was only the decree of being a ger, of being a stranger, that applied and included all of Avraham's descendants. Va'af b'Shevet Levi niskayim, and this did apply to Shevet Levi. It applied to all of the Bnei Yisrael and Mitzrayim, including Shevet Levi. Shahayu gamheim gerim b'Mitzrayim. They were also strangers in Egypt. So all of the part of the pasuk that talked about when Hashem said to Abraham at the Bris Bein HaBesarim, and your children will in the future be gerim, they'll be strangers in a land that doesn't belong to them, in a foreign land. That in fact applied, Zera Shimshon says, to all of Bnei Yisrael, including Shevet Levi. The ode, but then when we look further in the pasuk, va'avadum ve'inu losam, and we see later in the pasuk it says they will be enslaved and they will be oppressed. Lemishahu roy lavo. This only applied to those members of Bnei Yisrael who were roy, who were fit in Hashem's eyes to have to do the slave labor. Ve'eno kolel l'chol zarecha. And it does not include all of Abraham's children. So let's pause here because we can already sense the fact that the Zera Shimshon is saying something of fundamental importance and also very, unless one's familiar with this idea, a very novel idea, which he's going to expand even further. What he's saying is that the well-known pasuk, the well-known prediction that Hashem gives that Hashem foretells to Avram Avinu by the bris bein habesarim, ki ger yeh zaracha be'eretz lo lahem va'avadum ve'inu osam. That projection that the Jewish people, Hashem says to Avram, will be in a land that doesn't belong to them and they will be enslaved there, is actually a two-part projection. It's not one, shouldn't be viewed as one nevuah, one prophetic vision that Hashem is sharing with Avram Avinu, but rather it's in two parts, a part A and a part B. The part A is the part about ki ger yeh zaracha be'eretz lo lahem. Hashem says to Avram, all of your children will be strangers in a foreign land. That applies to everyone, no exceptions. It applied to Shevet Levi as well. And then we have to put kind of a break or a semicolon in the pasuk, and then it says va'avadum ve'inu osam, and this foreign people will enslave them and will oppress them. That did not necessarily apply to everyone. That was going to depend on a determination that Hashem would make as to which ones of Bnei Yisrael, which ones of Abraham's children, Zaracha, Hashem used that word, which ones of Abraham's descendants were ro'oi, where it was fitting in Hashem's eyes for them to do slave labor, and which ones possibly were going to be exempt from slave labor. And of course, the Zera Shimshon feels applied to Levi. They were exempted from the slave labor. Let's continue. The Od Yesh Lomar, and we can expand this idea. We can say more about this idea. The Isa b'Medrash, it states in the Medrash. This is from, you'll see the source there, which actually has a little small typo. It says Shmos Rabbah Aleph Yud. It should be Aleph Ches. It's in section Ches of the first section of Shmos Medrash Rabbah. But in any case, what does it say? Al pasuk Vayakam Melech Hadash. The Medrash is commenting on the pasuk that a new king arose in Egypt. And so the Medrash says, Kishemes Yosef, when Yosef died, a Feru bris milah. The Jewish people stopped keeping bris milah. Amru, and they said, Niya kimitzrim. We want to be like the Egyptians. So as long as Yosef was alive, everyone kept the traditions that had been passed down to them, including, of course, bris milah, which started with Avram Avinu and was a central part of what his descendants did. Abraham passed it to Yitzchak, to Yaakov, and everyone circumcised them, their babies, and everyone was had a bris milah. But after Yosef died, some of the Jewish people started to say, we don't need to keep bris milah anymore. It's batter for us if we fit in more with the Egyptians. V'kivan she'asu kain, and once they did this, hafach HaKadosh Baruch Hu ha'ahava, shehayu hamitzrim oavim osam. Hashem turned and changed the love that the Egyptians had felt for them until that time, l'sina, to hatred. Right? The Egyptians originally loved the people they called the Ivrim, the Hebrews, because this small group of people came down and Yosef had saved everyone from the famine, and he was an extraordinarily famous and important personage in Egypt, and he brought his family down, and the Torah specifically told us that this was viewed as a good thing by Paro and by the Egyptians when Moshe brought his family down. So there was a positive feeling for Bnei Yisrael up until the time that they started doing bris milah. Shenemar, as a pasuk in Tehillim says, Hafach libam lisno amo. He changed the heart of the Egyptians to hate his people. So there was a drastic change in the way that the Egyptians perceived and felt about the Jews. And according to Zera Shimshon, the cause of that change was the fact that after Yosef died, Bnei Yisrael stopped keeping bris milah, and now the Egyptians began to have negative feelings toward them. Ve'af kan kosher. And we have to ask a question on this. V'chi im hayu mekayim mitzvahs hamilah lo hayu hamitzrim meshabdim osam. are we saying that if they had continued to fulfill the mitzvah of bris milah, that the Egyptians would never have started hating them and therefore would never have enslaved them? Is that really what we're saying? That everything changed because they stopped keeping bris milah, but had they continued doing bris milah after Yosef died, then there would have been no hatred, there would have been no oppression, no anti-Semitism, no slavery. But we saw from the pasuk that this was already decreed by Hashem, that the Jews would be enslaved and oppressed. So how can we say, on the one hand, there is a clear pasuk in communication from Hashem that the Jews were going to be enslaved in this land that wasn't theirs, in Egypt, and on the other hand, we have an idea here that there were actually the apparent possibility of the Jews not being enslaved if they had continued to keep bris milah. But now we have to say, we are compelled to say, that the only absolute part of the decree that Hashem communicated to Abraham was about the gerus, about being strangers in a land that did not belong to them. That was the only absolute, definite part of Hashem's prophecy, or Hashem's nevuah that he was sharing with Abraham that had to take place. And therefore, because of this, hiktim, Hashem put first in the pasuk, Higer Zaracha, your descendants will be strangers. Again, the Zera Shimshon very early on in this piece pointed out to us that the order of the words in the pasuk and the fact that the pasuk split ger, being strangers, from va'abadum ve'inu osam, from enslavement and servitude, was extremely significant. And so now he's coming back to that idea, and he's saying the reason the Torah put ger first in the pasuk was to say, everyone, absolutely, your descendants, Abraham, will be gerim. They will be strangers in a land that doesn't belong to them. But that's the only part that was absolute and definitive. Kenizkar le'el, as we explained before. Va'achar kach, and afterwards, im lo yizku, if they don't merit it, yitosaf alehem hashibud. Then, in addition to being strangers, there would also be servitude added to that and placed upon them. But only if they don't have the merits to protect themselves from that. It wasn't definite. It wasn't absolute. The servitude was not. Bizehu, and that's what it means in the last half of the pasuk. Va'abadum ve'inu osam. They will be enslaved and they will be impressed if they don't have the merits to protect themselves from that. V'hoil sheshevet Levi lo hefiru bris milah b'Mitzrayim, and since Shevet Levi did not give up the commandment of bris milah in Egypt, kedichsiv, as we see in a pasuk in Devarim, that's from the end of Devarim in Vizos HaBracha, where Moshe Rabbeinu is blessing each one of the tribes. So when he gets to Shevet Levi, Moshe Rabbeinu says, amongst other things, Ki shamru imrasecha uvrischa yinsoru. Moshe Rabbeinu says about Shevet Levi, they guarded your words and your covenant they protected. And that's a reference to the fact, Zera Shimshon says, to the fact that Shevet Levi was meticulous and careful in all situations and all circumstances to keep the bris, to keep the covenant, meaning the bris milah. So since Shevet Levi kept the bris milah, even after Yosef died, and they never gave up careful observance of the mitzvah of bris milah, so minadin hayashalo yonemi b'chlal hashibud. Then therefore it was just and lawful for them not to be included in the servitude, ella b'chlal hagerus, but only included in the absolute part of Hashem's statement to Abraham, which was about being strangers in a land that was not there. So let's pause here, because here already, if the piece stopped here, we already would obviously have an incredibly important, powerful new idea from the Zera Shimshon, and that is that not just Shevet Levi, but all of Bnei Yisrael could have avoided becoming slaves in Egypt if they had kept the mitzvah of bris milah. By desiring to join Egyptian society and to become more like the Egyptians, and by giving up on the performance and the observance of bris milah, all of the tribes except Shevet Levi opened themselves up to what the Zera Shimshon described as the Egyptians beginning to resent them and hate them, and ultimately that's what led to the shibud. But the shibud, the enslavement and the oppression, did not have to happen. It was not inevitable. And if you say, how could it not be inevitable? Hashem clearly said it was going to happen. Well, that's the chiddush of the Zera Shimshon, to say, no, read that pasuk differently because of the way that the words are split up. The only thing that's definitely Hashem said is going to happen is the gerus. That happened to all of Bnei Yisrael. They all came down to Egypt, and they were all strangers in a land that, of course, was not their own land in Egypt. But the part about the shibud and the oppression, that's later in the pasuk because it wasn't definite and it didn't have to happen. B'derech zeh nami yuvan hapasuk higer yezaracha be'eretz lo lahem. Now we can take an even deeper understanding of the pasuk that we quoted in the beginning, where by the bris bein apisarim, where it says your children will be strangers in a land that is not theirs. Shelich ora be'eretz lo lahem. Apparently, at first glance, the words "in a land that is not theirs" heim devarim miyusarim. Those are extra words. Those are unnecessary words in the pasuk. That phrase "in a land that is not theirs" is not really necessary. The Zera Shimshon says. Why? Shehare dai lomar ki ger yezaracha. It would have been sufficient for Hashem to say to Abraham, your children, your descendants will be strangers. He doesn't have to say in a land that is not theirs. Pshita, because this would be obvious. Shemisha hu ger, because by definition, someone who is a stranger, eino yoshev be'artso. He obviously is not living in his own land. So the Zera Shimshon says, let's look at the pasuk even one step deeper. We don't need Hashem to say, ki ger ziyeh azaracha be'eretz lo lahem. We don't need Hashem to say they will be strangers in a land that is not theirs. Just say they will be strangers, and we'll understand that, of course, they're in a land that doesn't belong to them. Ulefi darkenu asi shakir. But according to the approach that the Zera Shimshon has developed, it all comes out very well understood. Shekach hayisa gezeres hamakom, because this was the decree that Hashem made. Shekesheyu miskaimim be'eretz lo lahem. If the Jews will fulfill the words, they're in a land that is not theirs, sheyia nikar, that it will be clearly recognizable, v'noda, and well known, shehem be'eretz lo lahem, and that they are in a land that is not theirs. Tahainu shehem mishunim. What does this mean? They're in a land that's not theirs, that they're different, that they're unique. Mehem, from the people who live there, from the natives. Sheyesh lahem hamila. And the sign that they're different and unique from the Egyptians would be when they have the bris milah, that the Jews kept the observance of bris milah. Then they would have been fulfilling, okay, you're in a land that doesn't belong to you, and you're not assimilating, you're not mixed in with the people of the land. You're clearly distinct and you're clearly separate from them. Az lo yiyeh ela gezerah shel ki ger yezaracha. Then Hashem would have decided that only the first part of the fact of them being strangers, that is what Abraham's children would have experienced. But if they never truly experienced being in a land that is not theirs, meaning if the first part of the Gezerah that Hashem said about the Jews being strangers in a land that is not theirs is never fully realized, it's never fulfilled. Kemoshe asu b'Mitzrayim, which is exactly what ended up happening in Egypt, she'amru nihiyah k'Mitzrayim, because they said after Yosef died, we want to be like the Egyptians. We don't want to feel like strangers, and we want to mix in with the Egyptians. And so they stopped performing bris milah. Sha'az lo nikar shehem gerim be'eretz lo lahem. Then it was not recognizable that they were strangers in a land that did not belong to them. Az yitosaf alehem gezeres hashibud. That then and only then was the additional experience of enslavement and oppression put on them. Ba'avadum ve'inu osam, and that's what the pasuk was referring to when it said they will be enslaved and they will be oppressed. So in other words, the pasuk itself, upon careful analysis, the Zera Shimshon is teaching us, tells us what Hashem meant. Hashem said in phase one, the Jews will be strangers, they'll be gerim in a land that doesn't belong to them. And if that is truly fulfilled in all of its meaning, then the second part of the projection of them being enslaved and oppressed does not necessarily need to happen. So how do they make sure that they're different and unique and clearly strangers in a land that doesn't belong to them? They don't assimilate, and they keep the mitzvah of bris milah as the oath, the sign that they want no part of being like the Egyptians. Unfortunately, only Shevet Levi made that decision and made that commitment and continued to observe the bris milah carefully after and universally after Yosef died, and therefore they were not enslaved. However, the rest of the Jewish people tragically and unfortunately gave up on the mitzvah of bris milah, began to assimilate with the Egyptians, and then that they did not have the protection from the second part of the pasuk, and it occurred to them, since they were now blending into the Egyptian society, they were then enslaved and oppressed. Last paragraph. Umikol makom. Nevertheless, the Zera Shimshon says, because here he has one loose thread to tie up. Nevertheless, hatam hazeh, the reason that was given, this reason that we're giving, eno soser hatam hanizkar le'el shel hamaforshim, doesn't necessarily contradict the reason that was mentioned before that the Meforshim gave. Let's pause so we understand what the Zera Shimshon is referring to. All the way back in the first paragraph of this section, Yud Gimel, the Zera Shimshon brought Rashi, and then he said, Upirshu, and the commentators explain that the reason Shevet Levi was not enslaved in Egypt, didn't have to do slave labor, is because Hashem knew they in the future would be working in the Mishkan and doing the holiest level of work in the Mishkan, in the Beis HaMikdash, and therefore he wanted to preserve them for that and not have them do menial slave labor in Egypt. So the Zera Shimshon says, we've developed a whole new approach to the question of why Shevet Levi didn't have to do slave labor in Egypt, and how that was also a possibility originally for all of Bnei Yisrael. And you might think that clearly contradicts what the Meforshim in the beginning that he brought down said, but he says, no, not necessarily a contradiction. Why? The Ikka L'meimar, because we can say, b'mikdash, the zechus that was known, of course, to Hashem, that in the future Shevet Levi would do the work in the Mishkan and the Beis HaMikdash, he amdalahem, it stood for Shevet Levi, shelo heferu hamila b'mitzrayim, that they did not give up doing bris milah in Egypt. So in other words, in the future, the work that Shevet Levi, the incredible role and responsibility that Shevet Levi had, the sacred work of working in the Mishkan and the Beis HaMikdash, that fact that was going to happen in the future came kind of back retroactively and protected them in Egypt and kept them spiritually strong. So it enabled them to do bris milah. And the fact that they kept bris milah and stayed separate protected them from the hatred of the Egyptians. Below hayu, the word is hayu, but it should be hayu, I believe. Below hayu machrichem osam l'shibud, and they did not force the Shevet Levi, the tribe of Levi, to do slave labor. As we explained at great length in the beginning of Parsha Shmot, the Zera Shimshon is referring to an early piece earlier in his the sections that he wrote on Parsha Shmot. Because all of the hatred that the Egyptians felt toward the Jews, and the reason they changed their attitude so drastically towards the Jewish people was because the Jews began to stop being careful about the mitzvah of milah, of ayin sham, and you can look there for further discussion. So amazing piece here by the Zera Shimshon, again, tremendous chiddush, and we're understanding from the Zera Shimshon that the seemingly absolute projection that Hashem shared with Abraham, that his children would be in a land that didn't belong to them and enslaved there, was actually not necessarily what had to happen. It wasn't inevitable, it wasn't inexorable, but rather the only part of it that was that they would be Gerim, they would be strangers there, but they did not necessarily need to be enslaved. Shevet Levi, in fact, only were strangers in Egypt, but were not responsible to do slave labor. But the rest of Bnei Yisrael, unfortunately, by giving up and not having the spiritual strength that they committed to bris milah, were in fact enslaved. And the second half of the pasuk from the bris bein habesarim was then fulfilled and then expressed itself on the rest of Bnei Yisrael. And all of that circles back to the beginning, to Rashi's insistence that when Paro said to Moshe and Aaron, go back to your your work. Rashi says, whoa, he can't, do not dare understand that as Moshe and Aaron go back to your slave labor, because it's axiomatic and of fundamental importance to know that Shevet Levi did not have to do slave labor, and therefore that can't be what Paro meant. He must have meant they should go back to their chores at home and do the things that certainly their wives wanted them to do, and do those labors and that work. Yasher koach to everyone.